Welcome to the land of pleasure.
Oh, yeah.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's only slightly weird.
Yeah. Yeah, that's. I was just thinking about that as we were going through that. Like, what said pleasure comes with, like, deep, sultry voices? Like, I don't know. What if it's, more like roller coaster voice? And you're like, oh, yeah!
And now we have 30 minutes of people achieving orgasm. It's just the sound, just 30 minutes.
And it's just like,
Yeah, that would be quite
it's more
entertaining.
like, it's like people on the toilet. Orgasm sounds kind of the same.
You just kind of weave them in there and see.
They're not real sure.
Yeah, you're just like, I don't know.
There was a old Saturday Night Live skit that was Plant or Animal, and it was either Robert Plant singing or an animal.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I like that one. Then. So good morning.
Morning.
How are you? Today is January 5th, 2021. Hump day.
Hump day.
Hump day.
I actually saw a camel in a show the other day.
Yes.
And of course, all I could think about was hump day.
Good. We have poisoned you.
Yes. It has really ruined my movie watching experiences.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they should be ruined.
So yesterday we talked about quitting.
Oh, right.
Yes, and there was at least one Jake Gyllenhaal reference. I think that's it.
Yeah. I think it was either him or old Heath.
Old Heath. And we talked a little bit about the thing that a lot of people kind of obviously think about with quitting, which is quitting a job. But we also talked about some of the other things that you can quit. You can quit people. You can quit habits you have. And I think we talked maybe about one or two other types of things that you could quit. But yeah, any big takeaways you had from yesterday or things that we should touch on?
No, it did keep running through my mind afterwards, the idea of
just couldn't
quitting.
quit, huh?
Yeah, I just couldn't quit thinking about quitting. It's interesting how, I don't know, sort of gumption, grit, fortitude, all these things are all preached to us all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what started running through my head was like, why do we have such a tremendous sort of fear of quitting? And I think part of it is when I was, of course, younger, than I wanted to quit things because I just didn't like them, but I hadn't given them enough time to develop into anything that I could like.
Yeah.
So this kind of, we didn't really talk very much about that sort of contradiction between actually working so hard at something that you become good at it, and then you derive pleasure at something because you're good at it.
Yeah.
And so if you go through your life quitting things early, then you never get to this sort of point of excellence.
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit about discussions we've had in our So Good They Can't Ignore Your Range our segments, where specifically in this case, we're talking about So Good They Can't Ignore You, a book by Cal Newport, where he talks a lot about, hey, before you go and switch to do something else, like you need to develop the skills that you're working on and create the career capital, and he's using it in terms of a career, but you could apply it in other areas as well. But that basically that same type of thing, you put in that dedicated practice to become better at the thing. And then he doesn't necessarily talk about the pleasure aspect of it, but
no. And if you want to take it into the relationship aspect, I have a buddy who is going through a breakup right now. And one of the things that he's upset about is that he has become a better person due to this relationship. But now,
I thought you said due to the breakup.
No. Well, what he was saying is that they're both losing out, but he was saying that his partner is losing out because they don't get to be around him being such an amazing person that they helped shape him into.
Right.
Right? Like essentially his thought is that they're bailing early.
Yeah.
And they're not going to reap the benefits from all of the amazing changes that have happened. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, and it's funny because it sounds selfish at the surface, but then you're like, well, it's really more like, no, like they did this work. They had to suffer
did it together.
Me,
they
right?
suffered together
Right.
to get to this point where they could finally have this good relationship. But then one of them is like, I'm out.
Yeah.
And you're just like, okay.
Well, that's the thing about quitting, right? And we talked a lot about it yesterday through the lens of myself, I'm choosing to quit. But there's also the other side of that, which is getting fired, which you could say, which is a breakup is kind of like that as well. And sometimes those breaks need to happen in order to be the catalyst for the change. And catalyst is a fancy way of saying that it's something that helps make the thing go easier or faster or make it happen at all. At least I first learned about catalyst in chemistry back in high school. Yeah. And it's like, oh, you mix these two things together and then they're fine. But when you add that third thing, oh, that's when the reaction starts. One example I can think of, which could be completely wrong, the hot hands, because it's so cold. I think it's like 50 here today. Yeah. Actually, I don't know how cold it is. It might be colder than that.
40.
Yeah. So, I mean, you got your scarf freezing on, which is good.
Yeah. Well, you only get 3 times a year to wear it. So.
Yeah. But when you have the hot hands, you open up the packet and then you expose it to air. And the air acts as the catalyst between the things, and you shake it, because you're working on getting the pleasure of the heat.
Yes.
And after you finish
how
shaking
do you do
it,
that again?
yeah. Well, sometimes you switch hands.
Really?
Because you have both. There's hot hands is plural, and then sometimes you can put them in your food. It depends it depends on the muscles, right? Because if you have done a lot of shake weight work, it might not be a big deal.
Oh, yeah, it's a good point. You gotta train
but catalysts,
yeah.
So catalysts, you talk about pleasure, it gets easy to get off track. So yeah, we're talking about quitting, and sometimes it takes that quitting or that firing or whatever to be that event that sparks you to make that change. And I've seen the same type of thing. I think it's pretty common in divorces as well, right? Because then it's like, oh crap, like something did wrong, and maybe it takes a while for the person to get there, but then they realize, oh, I was a part of that thing that was wrong. And then once they get to that, then it's like, maybe I can start to do a couple things different, and maybe I improve myself a little bit more. Kind of like we've talked about with Eric a few times, like bringing your best self and owning that personal responsibility, like we talked about a few weeks back with him.
Yeah. Yeah.
The last couple things on quitting. Oh, we had a nice little segment on quitting therapy. We've talked many times on the show about the value of therapy and encouraging people to try it. But then we talked about when it might make sense to quit and why that makes sense. And you also shared your personal story about how you recently, and quit may even be a strong word. Maybe it's just a pause, but maybe it is a quit. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Sometimes challenging yourself with other avenues and venues and testing yourself to see if you can fly on your own for a little bit. Yeah, of course, like community is great and fantastic to have around you, but there's other considerations as well, which we didn't really get into, which might also just be straight up financial considerations. And so that's one of the other things. These are often paid services, and unless you're insured, it can be difficult to get.
Yeah. We touched on that very briefly, and then the other thing I wanted to mention was our challenge. And with our challenge, we said, hey, why don't you ask somebody that's close to you that cares about you, and ask them, hey, is there something that I should quit? Because kind of similarly to these relationships we were talking about, a lot of times you don't see the change that you need to make, but it's very evident to everyone around you. And part of that is being open to hearing that. And we talked a lot about, hey, make sure you don't just go willy-nilly and then ask everyone and, hey, roast me, because that could end up real bad for a lot of people. So we had a lot of cautioning language around that. So before you go take that challenge, make sure to go listen to some of the warnings we gave. But that's a very powerful challenge. So if any of you guys out there have taken that, please go ahead and let us know how it went in the chat. If you're here live or if you're here after the fact, drop it in one of the comments, or you can also contact us at helpfulforlife.com. In the top right corner, you'll see a contact us button, and let us know. And if you want us to just let us know that you did it, that's great. We don't have to share it. We can also keep it anonymous, but we'd love to hear from you guys to let us know how these challenges are affecting you in your life. So any other thoughts on quitting?
No, I don't think so.
All right,
We
cool.
can quit.
We can quit quitting.
Yeah.
Well, with that amazing joke.
So amazing.
Oh.
Doop, doop, doop.
We were going to go to the intro, but it said video file not found. So we're going to pretend we're doing the intro. Boop, doop, doop, boop.
Hey.
Boop, doop, doop, boop, boop. Boop, doop, doop, boop, boop, doop, boop. Wow.
Helpful for life.
Hey, you got it. Oh, and here's the writer, and then here's us. Oh,
hi.
Welcome to What the Hell is Water. Today is December. Nope, it's not. Today is January 5th, 2022. This is episode 66, which I'm also just realizing today's Wednesday, which is hump day. I already realized that. But if you look at the sixes, they're kind of like a double-humped camel upside down.
With the legs sticking up in the air.
Yeah, they're just like...
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. I didn't see that at all.
I didn't either, but sometimes your
I'm
eyes...
supposed to be the artist here, but I don't know. It's doubtful.
You know, there's some times when you're just so deep into a craft for so long, you miss some things. And sometimes you just need some fresh eyes.
I apparently I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe we could trade eyes later.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about a couple of things, and the two of them are pleasure. You know, and there's this idea of, oh, pleasure, that sounds good. Like, oh, we should always just get more and more of it, right? That's totally a good thing, right?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, why not?
Perfect. And we'll find out what kind of truth there is to that, if any. And then we're going to talk also about video games. And of course, I mean, one can't talk about pleasure without talking about video games. But
Back
no,
in my day.
we're going to talk a little bit about how video games, you know, how that does tie into pleasure and how that can be one form. But we're also going to talk about video games from a design perspective. You know, we kind of teased it a little bit yesterday about how designing video games and architecture, and we also use the term architecture both in the sense of like buildings and things like that, but also in the sense of just being an architect of design, right? And you're designing a system or something like that. And I think we kind of started on that path from The Matrix. We heard, you know, you talked about The Matrix, which also has video games, and you also mentioned one of the main characters, the architect. And so we kind of were like, oh, yes, that ties to this and this and that. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And of course, in the new Matrix, they also reference not a set of movies, but Keanu Reeves' character has turned the Matrix into a video game.
Oh, nice.
So that people actually play a video game that is called The Matrix.
So they made it very meta, huh?
Oh, yeah. It was so on the nose that it's strange how it's like meta to reference all the things you already should know, right? And just be super obvious about them. So, yeah, it was kind of fun in that regard. Yeah.
I like that. Nice. I wonder how much of that they did to for people who hadn't seen any of the Matrices before.
Oh, maybe so.
I wonder if that was part of the thought process too.
Well, they did have a PR guy that kept on going, bullet time, bullet time. And he just kept saying it over and over again. So it was annoying.
That's in the movie?
Yeah, in the movie.
Great.
Like, yeah, one of the marketing PR guys just kept on repeating that phrase. And everyone's just like,
I like it. I also like just the idea of, and I like it because it's similar to what I do probably, right? But the concept of like thinking about all of the things that your audience is going to think and then like getting ahead of them and saying like, I know you're going to try and cancel me for that gay joke I made. And so here I am talking about me canceling. And,
yeah. You just jump out in front.
Right.
Yeah, but it was fun, but it was a pleasurable movie to watch.
Nice.
So,
wow, way to bring us back.
Of course, did reference video games as well. So that
nice.
was good.
So yeah, let's go ahead and jump in, and let's go ahead and start off with pleasure, because what better place to start, right?
Yeah. No. How would you even define pleasure?
That is a good question. So, off the top of my head, having never thought about this sentence or ever in my life, probably.
I was just trying to think about it too. I was like, I don't know.
So if I were to define pleasure, I think pleasure is it's a feeling that a human gets whenever they are either doing an activity or something is happening at them that invokes positive feelings in them.
Yeah. Yeah, like I'm thinking about things that feel good, joy, those kind of these kind of, there's a whole range of words we have for it, but yeah, some sort of emotional state, I would guess.
Yeah, and put in more plain language and less trying to make a definition. You just doing things or seeing things that make you feel good.
Yeah.
And I wanted to look up the actual definition now that we've guessed at it, which is as a noun, a feeling of happy satisfaction and enjoyment. As an adjective, used or intended for entertainment rather than business.
Oh.
And a verb, give sexual enjoyment or satisfaction to. And I want to make sure to read these examples. We have, she smiled with pleasure at being praised.
Oh.
And for the adjective, pleasure boats.
Instead of business boats.
Yeah. I want to go on a pleasure boat. That sounds fun. And then, tell me what will pleasure you.
Oh.
And this is brought to you by Oxford Languages, the the official dictionary that Google is using for their dictionary, at least for now.
Okay.
It's a pleasurable experience overall.
No, it's always kind of a curious thing. Like, I think that you've asked me a couple times, and I think one of the ones that stumped me, like at one point we were talking about like capitalism, and I was just like, what the, like, it's about capital, but what is like, and all of a sudden I was like, I hear so much about capitalism. So it's one of the things I think we run into with things like pleasure or happiness. Happiness is another one that's really seems to be interrelated. But this idea that you're somehow supposed to be happy or supposed to be experiencing pleasure, and it's your imperative, maybe even a moral imperative, to go out and find pleasure or happiness in some way.
I don't know if I missed the very beginning of that sentence or I just missed the thought flow. How is the pleasure connected to the parallel to the capitalism?
Oh, just it's a definitional problem for me. Is like you kind of go, when you were asking me about capitalism, and I got stumped because it was so. I've been using the word capitalism so much that I had forgot what it actually meant.
Gotcha.
So when it comes to something like pleasure or happiness, like, how do you actually define that? Or is this just a word that we're bandying about and using all the time? So that's where my brain was going with it, is I would just, not to be facetious or have a real point to make there, but it's just one of those things of like, if we use something often enough and then we just start believing in it without actually considering what's behind it. And so I kind of think that happens to us with pleasure and happiness.
Yeah.
But I'm not even sure how you achieve these things sometimes, because I have just thought of them as an end to themselves.
Well, that's why the verb says, tell me how you want to be pleasured.
Want to be pleasured.
Yeah.
Tell me.
So, no, I think we do that with a lot of words too. And also like a lot of things, right? We conflate things with it, and you hear it used in certain ways, and even if it's completely wrong, and then that's where you pick it up, and then it just kind of goes. And another fun, somewhat related thing was like when you have a word that you read somewhere in a book or a magazine or article or whatever, but you've never actually heard it aloud. And then like one day you hear someone say it, and you're like, huh.
Is that how you say that?
Yeah. Uncanny. I couldn't think of any good ones.
No, my default is to always go back to facade.
Oh yes, facade. That's a good facade you're putting up there.
Yeah,
facade. I like it. So we've kind of defined what pleasure is, but I think one of the core questions is, so if it is this feeling, these positive feelings, these good things, these enjoyable things, whether it's sexual or not, whatever, is it? I mean, why not try and maximize that? What's the downside?
Yeah. Well, I think we could also ask, one of the things is maybe there's not any apparent downside at first. Maybe maximizing your pleasure, because it seems like a lot of pleasure, we've talked about avoiding discomfort as well. So if our evolutionary imperative that we've talked about on a couple of episodes is to actually avoid discomfort, if that's what we're trying to do, then it seems like it would be natural to go the opposite direction and actually chase down pleasure. But there's this thing called the hedonic treadmill, based on hedonism, and hedonism sort of being this chasing or pursuit of pleasure and happiness, and usually it's for yourself, not for anyone else. You're just chasing these things down. And then the kind of issue is, the reason they would call it a hedonic treadmill is, if you're pursuing pleasure, when do you ever get off?
Yeah.
It's a constant.
Well, it's funny because you just said get off, which is also involved in pleasure.
Right.
Yeah.
You get off while you're on the treadmill.
No, and another corollary or similar type of thing is, I guess, And well, let me give the example and then I'll give the abstraction. The example is money, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, people say, oh, money is important. Money is the thing that I want to do. I want to maximize. Well, it's like, okay, but then when is enough enough? And that's when you start to see these things where it's like, dude, you're already a millionaire. Like, why do you need a couple more million? Dude, you have tens of millions. Why do you need more? Oh, why you're at billions now? Why are you? When is enough going to be enough? Like, you've already way surpassed your actual needs.
Yeah, there was ambition at one point, but there was a avoiding of discomfort, so you get enough money to avoid discomfort, and then all of a sudden you're chasing this thing, and is this giving you pleasure to have more money at some point?
Yeah.
Or are you just chasing it because you don't know what else to do now? Like, those are, once again, so coming back to these kind of basic definitions of why we're doing these things, it's all up for grabs. It's up for a question, and at some point you start going like, oh, your psychological coping mechanism that was to have lots of money that got you to feel good about yourself, well, now you don't know what to do unless you get more money because it's the only way you can keep feeling good about yourself.
Right.
And so we can kind of, if you want to sort of go, and this is, of course, pop psychology stuff. This isn't deep, but I think there's something about that. The hedonic treadmill is an interesting idea because the problem with it is when you're pursuing pleasure, whatever that might be, and it can look like something good. It can look like fitness. It can also be
helping
food.
The orphans.
Yeah, it can, right. So this is an interesting one because it goes, if you do something like helping the orphans,
why would you do that?
Why would you do that? Yeah, because does it bring you pleasure? Do you feel good about yourself?
Yeah.
And the answer is probably yes. So if you're doing it for yourself, not actually for the orphans, does that make this a worthwhile pursuit?
Then that's up to you to decide.
Well, yeah, it's still probably good for the orphans, even if you're only doing it for yourself. So that's kind of you have these deeds that can be shaped in society, and the way society views these deeds is beneficial. And then you can accrue value from performing the acts that society gives you. So you can basically build up your karma points by performing deeds like caring for orphans, and then you get to feel good about yourself at the same time. So this is all a very cynical version of finding pleasure. Even when you're trying to give somebody else happiness or fulfill somebody else's needs, you're bouncing it all back into yourself, and you're taking all of this pleasure onto yourself, and you're saying, oh, no, even when I help the orphans, it's all about me. And so that becomes this kind of, even there's a pleasure cycle in altruism. So this becomes, unfortunately, a very cynical way to sort of approach the world. And I listened to a podcast that was talking about some of this, and there's Dr. Paul Bloom on Philosophy Bites. And it's about a 20-minute podcast. And one of the things that he was talking about is this doesn't seem to be the way that the world actually works. But there is this idea that you can shift every act that you do, even helping your child, so they can pass a test when they're going through school or something. Are you doing that for yourself and for your own pleasure? Or are you honestly just doing it to help your kid, right? Like, we don't have to turn everything that you do into some sort of system for judging pleasure. But that's one of the basic tenets of utilitarianism, is to be based around the most happiness for the most people. So I'm kind of using terms happiness and pleasure here interchangeably, but I think it's a kind of a premise that we have, since Jeremy Bentham is one of the guys that came up with utilitarianism, and it often sort of dovetails into libertarianism. And so a lot of that has to do with happiness. And what's kind of interesting about it is pursuing happiness is a great good. It's actually considered a moral imperative. And when you get into this far enough, then you maybe start shifting other values into a pleasure principle. And this can actually discount them of their real truth, the real reason you're doing them. The guy, Paul Bloom, brings up that if a soldier jumps on a grenade to save one of his comrades, is that for his own pleasure? No, but there's some value in it, right? And so there's these kind of little thought experiments and examples you can give where not everything can be reduced down to the pleasure drive.
All right. So what you said was, first off, it sounded like this whole conversation, you're looking for the pain in pleasure. Like, what's wrong with you? I mean, come on. And then you're saying, okay, not everything can be boiled down to a simple point. I mean, wow, way to go. Right?
Yeah, thanks.
But the other thing I wanted to point out was, you mentioned altruism. And as we're talking about pleasure and we're talking about, choosing happiness, choosing pleasure, choosing whatever, I'm thinking about, like, you're trying to maximize something. right? You're trying to optimize for something.
Yeah.
Or if you want to get into design, you're designing for X. You're designing for something. And in this case, if it's pleasure, then that's what you're designing for or whatnot. But when it comes to altruism, which give me a quick definition of altruism.
Being, I guess, altruistic is somehow giving back to society without concern for your own benefit or self-interest.
It's like selfless.
Yes, that might be a good way to think of it. Yeah.
And so as we're talking about, what are you going to maximize? What are you going to try and do? I can't help think of the, philosophical discussions where it's like, oh, okay, are you trying to do good? Are you trying to maximize the most good in the world? Are you trying to maximize the most good for you? Are you trying to maximize the most good for others? And I know there's, terms for all of these things, which I don't know off the top of my head, but, when you're talking about this discussion of pleasure, like you gotta have some sort of like, well, which one am I trying to do?
Yeah. I think what ends up happening when we talk about the hedonic treadmill is oftentimes that's pleasure for yourself. And one of the things that they say is the issue with pursuing pleasure for yourself, for your own end, so that you can feel fulfilled as a person.
Yeah.
Whenever you're just pursuing this all the time, the problem is you have to keep running faster and faster. You have to, because your pleasures plateau. And as a human, evolutionarily, we need higher and higher stimulations to keep this going, unless you go through a dopamine reset, which is to go without for a period of time. And that's something Dr. Andrew Huberman talks about. But one of the funny things about this is, as you're sort of scaling up these pleasure principles, it's always more pleasure, more dramatic, more and more and more. And so you have to run faster on this hedonic treadmill until there becomes a point where you're actually crowding out other concerns. And that's all you can do is chase pleasure all the time.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people might be in this trap right now, whether or not they realize it, right? Especially in this day and age, it's so easy to get on that treadmill. It's like you just need to pay a couple of subscriptions, like $7 a month here, $0 a month here for my TikTok, $0 a month for my Instagram. And next thing you know, you have all of these hits of dopamine coming at you. First, it's like, oh, YouTube, the internet, this is a kind of cool thing. I can sit here and have a session where I'm looking at one thing for, I don't know, 30 minutes, something like that. And then it's like, oh, maybe a YouTube video. That's nice. I'm going to watch something that's like 10 minutes, something just like 10. That. Yeah, just 10, 30 is a little too long. Oh, okay. And then now let's go, oh, it's this TikTok. Oh, no longer than a minute. Perfect. Even more pleasure in less time.
I get to consume more content that's more specially, concisely curated for me.
Yeah. And then, and then I can just go like this and just keep swiping and more pleasure just immediately downloaded like the Matrix.
Yeah. It's also, it kind of, when we start talking about it in those terms, it definitely seems like a kind of a quantity thing. Like, what is going to make me the most happy is more. Like, I need more screens with more videos flipping faster so I can consume 1,000 pieces of content in a minute. And then that will finally make me happy, right? And so we keep upping the levels on this. And so you can kind of see like a future, like a dystopian sci-fi world where you're just surrounded by advertisements all the time. You're so stimulated, you're just sitting there twitching.
It's called Times Square.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
But I don't know. I've been doing this thing over the last couple months where I start viewing most everything as a drug. And it's like, hey, okay, wow, okay, pleasure. It's not something you really think about as a drug on the surface, but you're doing something, you're getting some value out of it. Then the more you do it, your tolerance increases. Same kind of thing with alcohol or caffeine, or if you want to get into the harder drugs. I don't know that much about the tolerance with those, but pretty much most drugs, your body gets used to the amounts you're doing and the timing you're doing them, and then you got to do more to feel that same amount, right? And then there is this thought of a reset. And it's funny that you mentioned the dopamine reset, because I was just talking with a friend the other day about how they're doing a 14-day detox, where it's like they're not doing any caffeine, they're not doing any alcohol, no marijuana, no harder drugs, no nothing. They're just doing absolutely none of those things for 14 days to kind of reset their body. and it kind of resets the tolerance and maybe gives the liver a break and all those
Yeah,
types of
yeah.
things. Depending on who
No,
you are, that might be
it's a
more
good
or less
idea.
valuable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a good idea overall. It is kind of interesting to do them all at once, like because that's a challenge.
Hmm.
And so I imagine at the end of that 14 days, they're gonna be like, "Blah,"
Yeah. Well, to start it off, they got their COVID booster too, and they're like,
Oh man.
so now it's day one. I'm feeling like crap, and I had to go back to work, and I'm doing this all
Yeah,
detox,
oh man.
and it's
Yeah.
like, and I feel horrible, but all my coping mechanisms are gone.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like the opposite of the hedonic treadmill.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to layer as much pain on top of myself as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, which goes back to this idea of like pursuing pleasure. There's a lot of things we do in life that are not really about pursuing pleasure. And that's kind of a fascinating kind of thing when you get into it. It's also fun to sort of bring up this kind of idea of happiness and what it is and how you're supposed to achieve it. I remember and it's still going on, but there's this kind of fad of like the 10 happiest cities you can live in, and they'll write books about how the happiest population and all this kind of stuff. So there becomes this idea that happiness is some sort of thing that is a metric that can be achieved, and if you plug in all the right numbers and dials and levers, then we can get to happiness. And yet there's other people that I think it was like kind of, to paraphrase Aristotle, at some point he was saying that like happiness is when a creature moves the way it's intended to move. And so happiness actually ends up being a byproduct of you doing something else that's intentional and purposeful.
Yeah.
And that's a different way
I
to
like
look
that.
at happiness, so that you don't have to get it all caught up in pursuing it itself. You pursue something else, and then happiness shows up out of the blue.
Yeah, and to be frank, I haven't like let this mull for a long time. This is just kind of off the top of the dome here, but that seems like a good way to live, which is do not try to pursue happiness or pleasure or money or any one of these things, right? The metrics, if you will, but instead intentionally pursue other things that will have the byproducts of money and pleasure and success and happiness and things like that. Seems like a decent start.
Yeah, like, and why not? I mean, if you get down this path and you have accumulated a lot of skills and value and all this other kind of stuff, and you still don't have happiness, well, okay, you can jump into something else. It's fine. But I think the issue, the sort of danger that we're bringing up here is not to not pursue happiness, but if your only pursuit becomes happiness and it becomes an overriding pursuit, then at the end of it, you have burned through everything on your pursuit to happiness. So maybe you have some great experiences lodged away, but there is this kind of idea that becomes a never-ending cycle that's really hard to escape.
Yeah, kind of like we were talking about yesterday when we were talking about quitting, right? It's like sometimes you may not even realize it, but you have this really tight grip, this vice grip on whatever the thing is that you may need to quit, right? So same kind of thing here, like, oh, I need money, need pleasure, need this thing, and then you just kind of tighter and tighter and tighter until you get a hemorrhoid, because she just pops on out. It's just like, wow.
Oh, yeah. Transitioning from the hemorrhoid, yeah, the guy, Paul Bloom, in the podcast, he used the term enduring values.
Okay.
What does it mean to pursue enduring values? And all this time spent pursuing pleasure, what if it was spent actually pursuing something else that was more valuable over time? So I liked the notion of enduring values, because it's not something that I encounter or think of very often. And this comes back to living in a pleasure society. Is that if everyone makes money off of us by solving our problems for us and giving us entertainment, then we are very much avoiding discomfort at all points. And yeah, what does it even mean to have an enduring value? You can easily think of things like family and some of these kind of topics, but increasingly maybe those are hard to suss out or pull apart from sort of entertainment and having your other problems solved.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to enduring values, I mean, just that word enduring, right? That implies that it's going to last for a while, and it's going to maybe even weather some things, right? It's going to endure, and it's going to keep going despite some issues. And when it comes to, we're talking about pleasure, money, happiness, all these types of things. Well, those are all pretty fleeting things. Money, once you get over a certain amount, can be less fleeting. But by definition, if you're living in a society, every month you're spending money, right, in order to live and do the things you want to do and whatnot. So it's fleeting, right? Happiness, that's a temporary feeling, right? And there's some discussion about happiness, instead of pursuing happiness, but pursuing joy, which is a little bit more enduring of a thing. And it's a subtle difference that we don't need to dive into right now. But for those who haven't heard that before, joy versus happiness is something that you might want to check out, and maybe we'll talk about another day. But yeah, and then with pleasure, like, oh yeah, you get those brain chemicals that make you feel good, but guess what? Those go away like pretty quickly. So I like that idea of enduring values, and it seems to go right along the lines of, hey, do these things that are good for whatever other reasons that aren't necessarily you're doing for pleasure, but they have those side effects or benefits of including pleasure and happiness and things like that. But a couple things. One, I wanted to make sure to mention the study, which I don't have handy. So if any of y'all in the chat or in the comments later after this is live can find it. But the study that shows the happiness or whatever with money, once you get to basically, I think it's like $75,000 of salary, like they show like that no longer starts to correlate after that. It's like once you get to that amount, which is like enough on average to like meet all your needs and get you those basic things that make you happy. And then after that, that's when it's like, all right, more money is not going to necessarily lead to more happiness. Are you familiar with that study?
Yeah, that story that came out a few years back, and there was even a CEO of a company in Seattle, I think, or maybe it's Oregon, I don't know, Washington, Oregon area, that just made sure all of his employees instantly made sure they were all getting $72,000 a year or whatever the number was. And then, basically took a pay cut himself, because he was like, well, if the studies can prove this and this will make all my employees this much happier and more productive in their life, why would I keep some of them at 30 and give some of them, 200? And so anyone that was at a lower level, he just bumped up to the 72, and that became the baseline for starting at his company. And I thought that was sort of a great sort of thing to do for for the people he's working with. I don't even know what poverty level income is in America, but it is kind of interesting to think if 72 is this kind of plot line where once you have that, then you can no longer be concerned about things like, what if my car breaks down? You actually might have enough money to fix it.
Right.
So you start weeding out the sort of fear and precarity issues that we have that cause so many other kind of health-related concerns, psychological concerns, and also family concerns, and even concerns that then will prey on our existing systems, such as having to go, emergency room visits and all these other kind of issues that start showing up. And so if you could kind of get society to a point where everyone was living at these levels, then what would happen, right? Like that's kind of the utopia.
That's the idea where people were pushing for the universal basic income. It's like, hey, well, if that's really true and this is what you need, like here, take away those concerns and see what could happen. And there's actually, for those who are interested, you can look up universal basic income. And there are some areas within the U.S., some cities, maybe counties, I don't know, but there are some areas where they're trying this type of thing as kind of experiments. And there are, of course, other countries in the world where this is a thing, right? So if that just something like, that's kind of interesting, I wonder how that would work.
Yeah.
You could look that up. Universal basic income.
Yeah, but it does. But I'm sorry, I was gonna jump in on that idea though, that once you get to a certain point that's a little bit beyond survival, but you're feeling comfortable, then adding more on top of it doesn't seem to give you the same level of high. You don't get the same adrenaline boost after that. You don't get the same pleasure from having another $20,000. Isn't the same as that going from 50 to 70. That was a tremendous boost that got you somewhere and really made you feel good and made your life measurably better in quality. And then after that, the quality doesn't keep going up at the same rate.
And I also wanted to point out, because I happen to know the federal poverty level for a family of two is around $17,000, and it goes down like, I don't know, 1,000, 1,500 per person, and up that much per person or something like that. So it's relatively low. And the reason I know that is because of health insurance. When I quit my job, I was able, Danielle still had her job for a little while, so we had health insurance. But whenever she quit her job, well, we then had to figure out our health insurance, and working with healthcare.gov, as some people would call Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that type of thing. And that's where you start to realize just how different things can be based on the state you're in. And within Texas, you have to make at least 100% of the federal poverty level before you can get any assistance from the government for your health insurance. So yes, I kind of had that same face whenever I first heard it. If you don't make enough money, you cannot get assistance with health insurance. And at first it's like, grr, how do you do that? Why? That doesn't make sense. All these types of things. And I'm like, yes, I had that reaction too, especially as the one trying to get the health insurance. But then I started thinking, okay, well, why would they do that? And I haven't talked to anyone, but the best thing I could think of is, okay, well, maybe they want to make sure that you are working enough to contribute to society enough, and you're not just going to, live off of the government type of thing. And what is the incentive you have to make more money, do more, contribute to society? That's the main thought process I could see, especially in a very red state, right? It's like we don't want the government to just, be a teat for everyone to suck on. We believe people should be doing more. And also, oh, by the way, another way that's handled in a lot of Republican states is, and libertarian as well, is we're going to have third parties handle that type of thing, right? Nonprofits, and they can deal with the sick, the poor, all that type of stuff. So just a different style of politics, which was a little different than the requirements in California, as you might.
Of course. They both have their advocates on multiple sides, and so it's kind of interesting to talk about the sort of. I think one of the reasons we were circling around this, right, was at what level you sort of have achieved your pleasure balance, right, or whatever it is for joy, whatever it is for happiness, just sort of being aware of those things, and then also sort of realizing that we're in a society that kind of, in a lot of ways, weaponizes things. And a lot of times the language will change, right? So, you need your best self, and that includes travel on American Airlines whatever it is, right? They sort of will turn these sort of slogans into your identity and your happiness will be based around you performing this act, which will cost you money.
Or buying this thing.
Yes, yeah. And so there's this kind of thing in there that kind of gets slipped in, which is also about your personal individuality. Your individuality gets tied into your happiness metric. And I think that's a difficult one to also sort of parse out.
Yeah, for sure. So we've been talking about pleasure, right? We talked a little bit about what it is, what the definition of it is. We referenced the podcast that you watched or listened to, which was called Philosophy Bites by Paul Bloom, which we've shared in the chat. We talked a little bit about the hedonistic treadmill, this idea of hedonism, which is I am seeking pleasure for myself largely, and it's a treadmill because it's recognizing that, hey, if you are going to optimize for pleasure and you're going to try and seek more and more pleasure, it's kind of like a treadmill, which, in case you're not aware, a treadmill just keeps going and going and going. It's like an infinite road. And also you were saying that it's actually, with the hedonist treadmill, it actually starts going faster and faster and gets harder and harder for you to achieve the same pleasure with the same input. And so another thing I thought about while we were talking about that was the law of diminishing returns.
Yes.
And that's where, like, if you have the graph, like you're getting this linear, I put in 1, I get back 1, and that's like that, and then at a certain point it starts to plateau, starts to get a little flatter. And one of the best areas I like to think of with law of diminishing returns, because it's just easy for me to wrap my head around, is schoolwork. It's like, hey, if I can not work that hard and get a 85 or whatever, then I do some studying and I do some work, and then I get up to, say, like the low A range. Well, I can do that, say, with an hour of work. Then to get from a 93 to 100, that's going to take 10 hours because, you don't know exactly what they're going to put, and, maybe they tweak this thing and they make it like a little harder, but you start to get a lot of diminishing returns once you get past that, point. And so for me, that was one where it's always like, all right, good enough. Like I could keep studying this stuff forever, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it is sort of an equation that can be made. And of course, during this time, you get to go pursue your other pleasures rather than spending 10 hours banging your head against a book or something.
Right.
So what would those other pleasures be, Ray?
Yeah, that is great. So before we move over to video games, and I guess just talking about pleasurable activities that you and I like to enjoy together, are there any other, topics within this pleasure that you want to make sure to talk on?
Oh, no. I mean, I think we
could pleasure ourselves forever.
Yeah.
which I know they would want to see.
Yeah, no, it's
join our OnlyFans now.
It's actually the same show on OnlyFans. You just get to pay. You pay for the pleasure.
Yes, I like it. I like it. So okay, so talking about pleasure for us personally, yeah. So what do I do for pleasure? So one, I do find some pleasure through the work that I do. Right. I mean, creating this company, I would, as maybe some people do this, but most people don't quit their job and work on something for years and years and years with no financial return if they're not either one, seeing the long-term play or getting some sort of pleasure out of the things that come from it. So I do get a little bit of pleasure from working, right? And also from, in the pursuit of that, learning new skills and becoming a better person, all those types of things. Those give me pleasure from the kind of more enduring values perspective. But from a more, I guess, hedonistic or short-term pleasure perspective, I like video games, as we've mentioned. I also play some sports. You know, I like the sports ball. I like disc golf. Some people call it frisbee golf. I play that pretty often. And then I play soccer once a week. And then I also play other sports too. Tennis, basketball, volleyball, these types of things. Just kind of depends on the season. So I get some pleasure out of that as well. And then... yeah, one of my biggest sources of pleasure for me, I'm very much extrovert, so I enjoy hanging out with other people. That's a huge source, and even like with video games, like that's a big thing for me, is playing with other people, connecting with friends, family, things like that. And then food. I could not mention food. I enjoy to cook. I enjoy to eat good food. I enjoy to have a nice experience dining. And then, of course, there's, you know, some drugs and alcohol in there for pleasure as well.
Yeah, yeah.
What about you?
Oh, nothing.
Yeah.
I avoid pleasure at all costs. Yeah, would never imbibe on the pleasure.
Good.
Yeah.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah, I've heard it's addictive.
Yeah.
This podcast.
That whole treadmill thing. Yeah.
and I abhor exercise.
Yeah,
and,
exactly. I'm looking for I'm looking for a pleasure float tank, personally. Like, just want to sit there and just not have to do anything.
Yeah,
just
sounds great.
with a feeding tube, maybe.
Sensory deprivation. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do derive a lot of pleasure from work and creating things and making stuff, and and even deriving new skills makes me feel, I don't know, like I'm somehow growing, and so all that kind of stuff, which actually sounds masochistic when you talk about what you have to go through to get new skills. And, you know, even the way that I spend my money is typically around things like tools and skills and things like that. That's I don't really like even going on vacations necessarily. They're always work related. And so, yeah, I've got all these kind of like weird picadillos. Good food is great, but I very seldom spend a lot of money on it because
there's also a law of diminishing returns with that too.
Yeah, man, talk about
sure.
a big one. Yeah. It's like I'd rather go to, like, you know, Momofuku or Sonic, you know, but nothing in between.
Nothing in between. I like it. The amazing point that I had. Oh, the skill-based hobbies. That's one of the things that I wanted to say. That's something that I personally derive a lot of pleasure about, but I also think, kind of as a blanket statement, like, I think humans, that's something that's appealing to them because, one, it's a hobby. It's something you're doing that you enjoy, so you should be getting some pleasure from that. But then since it's skill-based, over time, like, you develop and you do have some work aspect to it, right? But then you benefit and you progress, and then because you do that and you see that, you start to feel better, and then you get better, and it's a really cool thing. And that's what I think makes a really good hobby, and I think that's what makes a really good game. Is one, it's something that you can get started on relatively easily, but there's a very high ceiling of growth potential. And Rocket League, some people may think this is hyperbolic. I don't think it is, actually. It's one of the best games that I think has been designed. And that's because of this reason where, like, right now, if you wanted to, like, we could go in the other room and you could start playing. And, like, there is, like, a little bit of a hump at the beginning where it's, like, it's not the most fun right at the beginning until, you know, you start, it's car soccer. So you're hitting a ball with a car. So you're going to whiff the ball a good bit at the beginning, right? So once you get over that first hump and you can start hitting the ball, then it starts to become, you know, a little more fun. And then you look at, like, what the pros are doing, and it's like, wow, there's just so much in between. And the reason that is because you're controlling this car in 3 dimensions, and it's all completely skill-based. There's very, very little random chance in this game. And so, therefore, by definition, you get to train yourself and get better and better at this thing if you want to, right? And that's the other thing too. And this is, I think, a trap people fall into a lot of times with skill-based hobbies, is thinking that they always need to get better. They need to learn that new technique. They need to do that new thing. And then there's sometimes just like, no, dude, just play. Like, have some fun with it.
Yeah. Like, you don't have to become a concert guitarist or whatever. Or pianist. You can just noodle around on the guitar or piano.
Yeah, and recognize, like, hey, be realistic. Like, all right, do you want to get that good? If so, like, okay, well then what's your practice schedule? Like, and how often are you doing this? And do you have a coach and all these types of things? Like,
well, and there's probably not going to be a lot of pleasure in it after that.
Yeah, and that's when it's like, oh, the hobby starts to turn into more of a job. So that's a definite trap to fall into. So I think that might put the pin in pleasure, unless you have any other.
No, that's good. Yeah.
You did say Piccadilly, which is another P word, so I like that.
Well, what?
Pleasurable. I found it pleasurable.
I've got all sorts of P words.
Good. Good.
I'll start pulling
speaking
them
of P words, let's talk about video games. I don't know how that ties together. I'll let you connect that yourself.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, just thinking about, well, there's this thing between pleasure and. Oftentimes in seeking out pleasure, we're also seeking distraction. And that's fascinating because of the way my parents always viewed video games, right? The video game was a distraction from you actually, I don't know, being productive or studying or whatever else it was I should have been doing. Whatever it was, like, video games were not in there. You know, it was, even then when I did get to play them, then there was like severe time limits. Like, you only get 30 minutes, which means you never got past like level 3.
Right.
You know, it was, and then they'd shut the game down and you're just like, eh. So yeah, there was this idea that somehow video games were distracting you from being a real person. They were rotting your brain, all this kind of stuff. So, you know, whatever pleasure I got from them was so short-lived that eventually I just didn't take any from it and would just skip it entirely and go do something else.
Right. No, that's interesting. You weren't getting a big enough bump to really get the high from it.
Right.
No, and I think that's also something that kind of persists. And I do think people's minds have shifted a little bit on that. But one thing I definitely want to point out about video games is, you know, if someone says, I don't like video games, like, I just disagree with you wholeheartedly. I'm like, you may not like a video game or some video games, but there's so many different kinds. And if you're the type of person who say, I don't like video games, like, if you point and show me, like, here are the tens or hundreds of games that I've played, then I'll be like, okay, I believe you. But I think most people, like, do one thing and they try it in that one way, and they're like, nah, I'm not going to do that. And that's also like when someone tells me, like, hey, I don't like salsa. I'm like, hey, salsa is Spanish for sauce. So you're just telling me you don't like sauces, like, at all? Like, there's a lot of different types of salsas. Or I don't like curry. Like, same kind of thing. Curry is basically a sauce, and there's so many different types. So I encourage you at home, if you are one of those people who says, oh, I don't like X, it's like, okay, well, maybe there's a whole bunch of different types of things that you've tried. So same kind of thing goes with video games. Like, you could play like a puzzle game. You could play a shooter game. Oh, you're playing a shooter game? You could play first person. You could play third person. It could be goofy. It could be realistic. It could be squad based. It could be solo. Like, there's so many different variants of all these types of things. It's another comparison I have is, like, if you go to Vegas or New York City and, like, you don't have any fun, like, that's on you. Like, there are so many different things you can do. You can literally find, like, especially Vegas, like, they are, talk about hedonism. Like, that's where you go for pleasure. Like, you want to get away, you want to be away from people, you can do that. You want to go shoot a machine gun, you could do that. You want to fly in a helicopter, you want to watch people make fools of themselves, like, all of the things you could possibly want. You want to spend no money, you can do pretty much very little money in Vegas. You want to spend millions of dollars, you can do that too. So it's so with the video games though, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was, so it tied into the skilled hobby thing. Video games, people, if you view them as a skilled hobby, that's one way to change the light around it and help realize the value that they can provide. And then also the community building aspect that we talked about. Is, you know, it's valuable to have community. We didn't talk about the building aspect, but that's video games are a great way to help influence community and create community, and you can join communities out there that are already around these video games too. So if you don't have people, that's one way to find people. But if you do have people, especially if you're a guy, like, you know, it's hard to sometimes to connect with, for men to connect on a deeper level. Well, one of the ways that's common to do that is have some sort of activity you do together. And especially if you live apart, video games is a great way to do that, because anywhere you have an internet connection, you can play that video game together. So that's another reason why I'm a big fan of video games. But let's shift a little bit over to the video game design aspect. And let's look at it from well, I guess you tell me, because yesterday we were talking and you had some things pop in your head, so I wanted to talk about that. We were talking a little bit about architecture, and that could be from the game architecture, could be the building architecture. What slant do you want to focus on?
Oh yeah, like I think we can talk about it all, kind of all encompassing. The when I took some classes and ended up getting a minor in architecture when I was at Texas Tech and Texas A&M for a little while. And so what was kind of fascinating about that is almost everything that you're designing is for a human to sort of live in, right? And that living involves moving through, and it's all about this kind of pathway that they take, and you can influence whether or not that's a pleasant experience or not for them. And so there's interesting little psychological things you do as well to make sure that somebody, like the way they approach a space, and there can be levels of transition so that they are in a different state of mind by the time they enter the building, right? There's these kind of things that cathedrals do, for instance, where you go in through a small door and then you open back up into a vast space. And this is these kind of ideas of grandiosity and how to sort of invoke this. And so it's a lot of design and psychology that get mixed up together in architecture. One of the things that happens in video games is, of course, the same thing, is that you're setting up these worlds, and then oftentimes you're controlling the aspect of how people interact with it. And so in that way, video games are really quite complicated, because, of course, we went from things like, say, a Wolfenstein first shooter, whatever thing kind of thing, and it's very straightforward, and you're almost in a maze, and you're just wandering through these hallways. And then we've gotten now into these sort of epic games where you can go explore anything you want to and go pursue anything you want. And some games are increasingly just built around the beauty of the game. There's not so much shooting and killing anymore. So the narratives are completely changed, and all this kind of stuff. So I think what's kind of fascinating is the architecture of it and the psychology that's behind it. When you're talking about people want, like, what kind of person you are, man, if you just want to explore crazy universes, you can do that now. If you actually want to fight people into squads and go up against other people as competition and plan raids and things like that, you can do that. And so the worlds are very, very different now, and you can even evolve some of these worlds. What was the game Evolution, where you just spent your time evolving species, and that was your sort of
That's
basic
cool.
job.
Yeah, it reminded me of another game that came out, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago now. I'm not exactly sure, but it's called Spore. Spore, like a spore, like a bacteria spore or something like that. And you start out in the game like a little small single cell organism or something. And it's been a while since I played it, but so I don't remember the exact progression. But basically, you start out in one type of arcade type game where you're floating around, and you got to eat some stuff or whatever. And then you start to grow, and then you get bigger, and then you evolve to the next stage, and then you evolve to the next stage, and next thing you know, you're able to like walk around, and then you're on this planet, and then if you want to, and again, this is all if you want to, it's a sandbox. Sandbox is a term meaning it's open, you can do what you want, there's not a strict thing that you need to do. Another opposite term of that is railroading, which is like, think of railroad tracks, like this is the way you need to go. And some other terms are the main quest versus the side quests. And just exploring, which could have no quests at all. So then when the game Spore, after you go legs, well, then you can start to develop some technology, and then you build a rocket ship, and then you can go to other planets, and then you can start exploring other systems and all that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of cool. You start literally at the lowest level.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, like in a way, you're playing a different game at every stage because it's like a different thing you're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Once you enter a different context or environment, then it scales up, and yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff in there. Just all to bring up that there's so many different kinds of video games out there now. There's, to sort of wrap it back into the idea of pleasure and like enduring values and some of these things we touched on earlier. And I think I might have brought this up before, but there's a guy named Robert Nozick, and I think it was in the 80s or whatever, he came up with a thought experiment that really kind of led to the Matrix. But it was this idea that if we could put you into an experience machine, and this would be a tank, your brain would be attached to diodes or whatever, and you could, in your mind, live out this kind of amazing life where you could have all these fun experiences and you could have whatever you wanted. What if that meant that you wanted struggle, then you could have struggle. And if that meant that it was pure pleasure all the time, you could have pure pleasure all the time. Then would you be willing to sacrifice your actual life to live in this digital life? And back when he came up with the thought experiment, everyone said, well, the obvious answer is no, I wouldn't want that life. And then this guy, Paul Bloom, was actually saying that they're running into the opposite today. More and more increasing in last 10 years or so. Then he has a lot of students who are like, yeah, that sounds great. Plug me in.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I would want to sort of bring up in terms of the video game as well, because these worlds are getting dense and rich and complicated. I think whenever the worlds were kind of shabby, then we couldn't envision living a full or rich life in them. But as they become more sort of deep and complex with multiple levels of challenge in them, then you can kind of curate your life around different things, and people are going like, yeah, I could actually see that, and that would be a fine life. It might actually be better than this one.
Yeah, and that's a little scary.
A little
just
bit throwing it out there.
Black mirror type of thing. And it made me think of a video, a TED Talk by a guy named Mark Rober. He is one of the most popular and arguably best YouTubers out there. Now every time he releases a video, like, goes on trending, probably on the front page, all these type of things, if that means anything to you as a listener. But also, like, he releases a video and, like, next day is like millions, if not tens of millions of views, like super crazy fast. And one of the things he's most well known for is the package glitter bomb. Where around so he's now done it like 4 or 5 times. So a couple years ago, he gave a TED Talk, and he called it the Super Mario effect. So I'll share that link in the chat, and it's talking about how video games do this. They do this thing well of, hey, giving you friction and stuff that you have to work through to get that sense of accomplishment, that sense of feeling, achievement, things like that, but not so much to where you feel like you're failing and you don't enjoy it and then you quit. So one example for me is like with puzzle games, like personally, I'm not a big fan of repetition, not just with puzzle games, but in life. Like if you tell me, hey, do you want to try this thing that you've already tried, or do you want to try something new? I'm going to try the new thing. That's one thing about me. So with puzzle games, after I try a level a couple times, if I'm not getting it, like there is a little bit of time where it's in that in between where it's like, okay, I'm getting a little bit of pleasure, especially once you get the achievement. It's like, oh yeah, it worked. It felt good. But then after a while, I'm like, nah, I'm done.
Yeah. No, I think it might not be rich enough. I don't get enough reward from solving a crossword puzzle every day. So I know a lot of people do. They'll sit down and solve it, and you go, are you getting pleasure out of this? And they're like, no, I'm not getting any pleasure. Well, why are you doing it? I don't know. I'm just doing it.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the other things that comes in with the puzzle games is I don't feel like I'm progressing enough, or that this is going to apply in any real way to anything real for me. And that's one of the things I've always had issue with video games is you can spend a lot of your life in them, and what are the results of that, right? If that time was spent, I don't know, constructing something for yourself in some other domain or realm, what would that be? And so it's really a matter of trading time. And so that's one of the ways that I kind of think about video games. And when I have the time to spend and I want to trade it for that kind of entertainment, fine, but also realizing I could be spending that time in other ways. Mm-hmm. So I really block it off, because I've also watched some people go down this rabbit hole of just dropping out of school because of video games.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the thing, talk about drugs, same kind of concept. Video game is kind of like a drug as well. And if you're not careful and you don't put up the guardrails or the systems in place to help you, especially if you're an addicted personality, right? Like, depending on who you are, like you can, especially if you've lived for a while and you've been exposed to some things, you can get a little feel for, and if you haven't done this before, maybe you just need to reflect a little bit. Hey, when I get exposed to something that is enjoyable or I like, am I an addictive personality? Is that something I keep doing over and over and over again? And I have some friends, I'm like, oh, like, you never tried this? And like, no, I know that if I do that, like, I'm going to go move into my basement and never leave. So I just never played. Right. Yeah. And I would say that's true for certain video games. Right. Yeah. And so that's like, for example, with World of Warcraft, I've never played that game. I think I would enjoy that game. I mean, one time I saw a friend playing, I'm like, he's riding a pig. He's purple and he's throwing magic at these things. He just blew all that stuff up. I'm like, I think I could enjoy that. That could be fun. But I recognize, like,
you've always wanted to ride a pig.
Yeah. I've always wanted to ride a pig. And here we are. But I had made the choice, like, I'm not going to do that because I know, like, it gets you on that wheel, it gets you on that treadmill, and I would probably enjoy it and have fun, but that's not how I chose to spend my time, right? And that's a personal decision. And there's many people who've fallen on both sides, like never played it at all and played it way too much. The one thing I wanted to touch on before finishing up was I'm going to share a video here. It's called "Video Game Architecture is Full of Secrets," and that is one that I watched a while back, and it was very interesting. It talked about the architecture, and I don't remember all of what was in it, but just to give a couple of examples of how physical architecture is used in video games. Well, one thing that is interesting is people don't necessarily realize it, especially now in the modern day console age, but the game needs time to load things. And so one of the way they design things is in a way to where they can load things in the background without you necessarily knowing that is going on. And so one thing is, well, hey, if I've got this block right here and the person needs to get to this other block over here, well, instead of just having a short passageway to them, well, I make this long, winding, narrow passage in between. Well, this block is loading that entire time.
Yeah.
But the player never realizes it. They're never, because they're still doing a thing. Another thing some people will do is they'll have some sort of activity or mini game or conversation or whatever. So in the background, all that processing power is being used to get all that stuff ready. Whereas like 15, 20 years ago, you'd play a game. It's like you do something, and then there's like, you got to sit there for 30 seconds while the next thing loads up. Yeah. And so that's one of the ways they use things like architecture. There's just a little fun way they do that.
Yeah, to sort of block the view. And then, what's become funny too is I think Jonathan Lethem talks about this, but it's just this larger theory that what if our world actually was a simulation that was always loading in front of us, and you can only see X amount and you can only focus on X amount, but if the world was having to be processed as you approached it, just like in a video game, as you move forward, then the video game has to process out in front of you. So there's this kind of never-ending cycle of having to process like that. And so they get into this fun idea of worlds within worlds, because what happens if this is a video game and we, with all these people, keep using up more and more processing power, then the video game server is getting very costly for them to run. And now we're inventing video games inside the video game and this kind of thing. And so they sort of set up this multi-level mini world series where all processing power is only based around your perception at the moment, which is just an interesting way to think of the world if the world did not exist outside of your viewing it, which starts tying back into quantum physics.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so it's this kind of fun series of sort of thought experiments based around, just the way that video games are made, just to speed things up and to keep them going. So our brains are actually learning a lot from us having to develop these worlds. And now those kind of thoughts are bleeding out and, sort of bleeding into worldview.
Yeah, and, we're going to talk about video games more than one time because there's so much that I'd like to share and talk about, but that's the thing about finding the different types of video games and trying the different types of video games, because if I'm playing, for example, what's called an RPG, a role-playing game, then that's me. I am literally a character that starts out with a certain amount of skills and abilities and a certain appearance. And as you go throughout the game and you achieve things and you do things, you can decide, oh, am I going to become a better fighter, a better talker, a better whatever? You can customize the attributes of the person, which is one cool aspect. It's like, hey, you get to go live this kind of alternative life in a different setting. You get to see these things. In a way, you get to live in a movie. And so I think for some people who've never tried an RPG, I think that is a cool thing to do. And that's usually a single player experience, but sometimes multiplayer stuff is involved in that as well. But that's very much focused on you, the character, the story, and things like that. And then there's also like party games where it's like, hey, me and Danielle might play a game together where it's kind of silly, it's light, it's easy, we're just having fun, we're maybe moving some shapes around to try and capture something, and that's just a completely different type of thing. And then, like I mentioned, there's the shoot 'em up types of games. And again, do you want like hey, I've got a lifespan of 15 seconds, I run in and blow my load, then leave and then die and then come back and repeat? Yeah. Or do you want something like, for me, I personally prefer stuff that's a little more strategic and squad based? So it's like, hey, for example, the Battlefield series of games. All right, I'm the medic. You're the guy who has the ammo. You're the person who is the sniper, and you're this other person who has that specialty. And we're going to work as a squad, and we're going to go do this thing. Or, oh, hey, maybe on this game we're gonna go get a tank, and you're gonna drive the tank, you're gonna fix the tank, you're gonna have a rocket launcher to go deal with the other people that when the tank runs into issues, like, and so you do these things and you have these tactics and you have this large enough map to where you have to plan your attack and things like that, and it gets a lot more strategic. So there's a whole bunch of things in there, but strategery. But we, of course, naturally, we could talk all day.
Yeah, no, video games are fun. We'll keep bringing them up because there's a lot of interesting spots that we didn't get into with them, because the design and psychology of them is profound, and it's actually revealing, I think, a lot about how we move through our current world. And so I think it can be applied over and over as kind of metaphor and analogy.
Yeah, and for those who are like, oh, well, video games, why would I, or how would I do that? Like, well, everyone probably has a smartphone, and you can play all sorts of things on your phone these days. You can even play like sports games like Madden football, or FIFA soccer, or NBA basketball type of games. Like, you can play all of those a lot of times now from your freaking phone. So you don't need to have a console. You also, if you have a computer, you can play a lot of these things. And a lot of the gaming platforms, Xbox for sure, I'm not sure if PlayStation does this or not, but they allow you to actually play a game without having the console. Like, you are streaming it from the cloud, essentially, the internet, and so you can play a game without your device doesn't have to be that powerful, because it's just getting the inputs. The processing's done in a server somewhere, and then it's just streamed to you. So for people who are looking to get into video games, you can actually do that relatively easily these days. So for a challenge for today, do you have anything that jumped into your mind, either on pleasure or video games, or?
No, not right now. I can probably come up with one if you don't.
No, I think I'll keep it nice and simple with this challenge, which is go play a video game. Like, especially if you're someone who's not played one before. If you are someone who plays video games all the time, try a different type of game. Maybe it's one that you've done a long time ago, or maybe it's one you've never actually tried. Another type of game is called a RTS, a real-time strategy type of game. One of the most popular ones of those is called Age of Empires. Another one is called StarCraft, and basically with those, you and the real-time strategy is a genre, so there's all types of things, but with the two that I talked about are kind of different skins of the same concept, which is where you start out with basically a home base and a couple of villagers to help you build up your city, get newer technology, better weapons, better horses, and then you build walls, maybe you build castles, and then you go and you try and attack the other people, but you're doing it in a strategic way. It's like, I recognize that, and it's kind of up to you how much you want to get into the strategy, but I recognize that the Britons, they have really good archery, and so I'm going to utilize them to take out this other civilization because of their inherent weakness or whatnot. And so you can get into some of that type of thing, and as you're deciding, like, they're sending lots and lots of horses at me, so I'm going to build more of these pikemen, which are really good against horses because they've got that reach and they can stab them. So yeah, that's the challenge for today. Go play a video game, and it could be on your phone, it could be on your computer, it could be on a console, or it could be streamed, like the things that I was talking about earlier. So go do that and let me know what you play. Let me know what you think, and also maybe bring a friend in. It's a different experience to play single player than it is to play multiplayer. So it's kind of up to you. Maybe if you're somebody who always plays single player, maybe you should try multiplayer. And if you're someone who's never played a game before, I'd encourage you to try both, because there are different experiences. And don't write it off. Don't say like, well, I tried video games, Reed, and now I'm never going to play them again. It's like, no, give it a chance. Try a couple different ones, and maybe you don't have to do them all right now, but that's your challenge for today. Do one of those. Real quick before I do our recap for today, I wanted to add one or two things from yesterday that I forgot to mention earlier in our recap for yesterday. So someone wrote in yesterday and said, another poignant point about quitting. They said, sometimes quitting something, let me start over. Sometimes quitting something reaffirms your first choice, and you can go back to it. You appreciate something that you miss sometimes. And I don't think we brought up that point yesterday. And this person was talking about, hey, for them in their life, they actually quit a job, and they're like, I'm going to go try out this job in a different field. And then they realized, nah, you know what? The grass actually isn't so greener in this field. And then they went back to that field that they were in the first place. So by quitting, it actually allows you to go explore that other grass and see what color it is and how it tastes if you like to eat grass, and then you can always go back to it. So I thought that was a really important point. And then also talking about quitting, there was this really sage, wise person who said this thing. things that suck stick the hardest. And so that maybe that makes them harder to quit. And this
No,
really,
I mean, are they talking about like putting a vacuum on yourself? And
well,
getting it stuck
actually,
to you?
it might have been me when I was in the shower, and I'll let everyone else finish that story. No, when I was in the shower and I saw a suction cup. And I was like, oh, and then I was like, that actually kind of does apply with quitting, like kind of like we were talking about with you grip so tightly on something that it's just really hard to let go of.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like, I don't know if you've ever touched like an electric fence, and your body just does. It's like that's the opposite of what I wanted you to do. Yeah,
yeah, shocking.
Yeah.
So for today we started off by talking about pleasure. We talked about what it was. We talked about, is it worth maximizing? Is it something that you should try and do a lot of? And the short answer is no, probably not. You might find yourself on something called the Hedonic Treadmill, which is where you're always seeking more and more pleasure, and it actually ends up taking larger doses of pleasure to even have the same effect on you. And so we also drew the parallel to, well, pleasure is kind of like a drug, and maybe you could view a lot of things kind of like a drug and say, hey, is there that law of diminishing returns where as I'm doing more and more of this thing, if you're a math person, is your slope decreasing? Are you starting to plateau? And so that's basically the main takeaway for me with pleasure is, hey, you don't want to just pursue pleasure for the sake of pleasure. We also then talked about enduring. They're looking for something that has a little more endurance. Enduring values, I believe, was the term. So trying to maximize your enduring values, which, by the way, as you're pursuing those, maybe a side effect or one of the benefits of enduring those values can be achieving some pleasure. And maybe that's through doing some meaningful work. Maybe it's from helping the orphans. Maybe it's from doing a skilled hobby or improving yourself in some way. But you're working on some task. And I want people to notice, I said the word work there. I think especially in America, especially in this day and age, people are so opposed to work, and they think that is the thing that should be avoided at all costs. And I think that's largely at the fault of a lot of employers, but that's also a mindset shift. And also, hey, you as an employee, you can influence and control some things as well. But as we all know, that's not perfect.
You know, we're talking about getting better at video games. That actually is work. We just call it play. So just you can invert those if you really want to. Like, you have to play mind games with yourselves, but a lot of these things do come down to sort of semantic quibbles.
Yeah. And so any other recap stuff on the pleasure aspect of things?
I did want to sort of bring up that you brought up very briefly, and I didn't fully address it, but there's a difference between like individual happiness and say something like societal happiness, right? And sort of which goals you're pursuing along those ends. And so that's something we can get into on another day, but like, yeah, what you do for yourself as an individual versus what goals you want for a society.
Yeah, and deciding like what are you going to, kind of from a philosophical perspective, what are you going to try and do? Are you looking for the greatest good for the most, just in general? Or are you looking for the greatest good in certain people, for yourself? Like, there's a whole bunch of different lenses to look at that through. And then after pleasure, we talked a little bit about how we pleasure ourselves. And then we talked about video games, because that's one of my favorite pleasures and pastimes. We talked about it from the pleasure perspective, how it is valuable, and how kind of like curry or salsa, like don't write off the whole video game thing just because you tried one. And also, there's been a lot of talk in the past of like how it drains you and it turns your eyes into squares, and it's no good for nothing, and you only should do X amount per day and all these types of things. And there's been a lot of negative language towards video games, but I would encourage you guys to explore that a little bit for yourself, because there's a rich world out there, and there's never been a better time to try out video games. And by the way, you don't have to play the newest or best video game. Like, there are some games that have stood the test of time because they're just really good games. Like, for example, Tetris. I mean, it's maybe simple, but that's a good game. And one trend I've noticed in cities over the last 10 years or so, as you're seeing more what's called a beercade, which is a barcade, where you have a bar that has a bunch of arcade games with it too. And I find those to be a lot of fun. You could go play pinball, you could go play your Pac-Man, your Galaga, all these types of things. And that used to be like a huge thing that like large portions of the nation went and did. Like, that's what they did. They went to the arcade. But then as the video games went into the house, that kind of changed, and it became actually less social. And it might be a little bit of a tangent, so I won't go down that path, but because there's a lot more we could talk about there. But bottom line is check out some video games. Any other thoughts on the video games?
No. We will be touching on it again.
Yes, we will. We will repeatedly. And that led us to our challenge for the day, which, as a reminder, was try a video game. And if you're someone who's already playing video games, maybe try a different type of game that either you haven't played in a really long time or you've never tried before. Also, maybe consider trying single player, trying multiplayer. So maybe especially if you're new to video games, probably in your life you might know at least one person who's played one or two, and if not, just ask around. You might be surprised at who plays video games that you had no idea, right? That's another thing, is the stereotypical picture of a person playing video game is a teenage boy staying up all night drinking Monsters and yelling into his microphone at 2 a.m. But video games played by all sorts of people from all over the world. And I also personally, I've gotten plugged into some communities and Discord communities where I've started to play with people from all over the world, which I've really enjoyed and gotten to know people from all over. And it's like, hey, I'm on this team now, because that's it sounds weird, it sounds nerdy, but I'm on an esports team and we play at a regular time. And there's one guy who's in Canada, there's one guy in Kentucky, there's one guy in South America. Like, it's actually pretty cool, and you get to talk to and learn and expose yourself to all these different things, right? So video games is another way to just change your environment and expose yourself to some new things. So with that being said, I think we've talked enough about exposing yourself and pleasuring yourself for one day. So y'all have a wonderful rest of your day. And don't forget, it's hump day. And goodbye.
you.